Nathan Lawson had always believed that a house was more than just walls and a roof. It was stability, a space to create, a sanctuary. For years, he had worked tirelessly as a chef, saving every spare dollar to finally buy his dream home, a quiet single-story house on the edge of town, tucked away from the chaos of city life. It wasn't grand, but it was his, and after years of renting cramped apartments above noisy streets, it felt like a personal triumph. The house had a spacious kitchen, something he had always wanted, with enough room to experiment with new recipes, film cooking videos, and maybe even start an online culinary brand. It had taken months to find the perfect place, a well-maintained property with a small garden in the back, and a front porch where he could sip his morning coffee in peace. The day he got the keys, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction, a rare moment where everything in life seemed to align. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. Nathan enjoyed the quiet, the privacy, the simple pleasure of making a house a home. He spent hours unpacking, arranging furniture, and making small renovations. His routine settled in, quickly waking up early to prepare for the day, testing out new dishes in the kitchen, taking late evening walks around the neighborhood. He wasn't the most social person, but he made an effort to greet his neighbors when he saw them. They seemed friendly enough, though there was something about the area that felt reserved. Conversations were brief, polite, never extending beyond the usual pleasantries. At first, he thought nothing of it. Some neighborhoods were like that, and he had no problem keeping to himself. Then, the strange things started happening. It was subtle at first, so subtle he almost ignored it. One morning, as he stepped outside to grab his mail, he noticed a small pile of cardboard boxes near his porch. They were flattened and stacked neatly, the way people leave them when preparing for a move. His first assumption was that the previous owner had left them behind by mistake, so he tossed them into the recycling bin and didn't think twice about it. But the next day, a new pile appeared, and this time they weren't just plain boxes. Some had labels on them, faded shipping stickers with a name he didn't recognize. At first, he dismissed it as a simple mix-up. Maybe a neighbor had put them there by mistake, assuming they belonged to him. He left them by the curb, expecting them to be gone the next morning. Instead, more appeared. It was the same the following week: flattened boxes, some with writing on them, others blank. But what unsettled him was the way they were always neatly arranged, as if someone was deliberately setting them down, rather than carelessly discarding them. It felt intentional. Then came the nameplate. It was a Sunday morning when he noticed it. His house number, a bold metallic plate screwed into the wood beside the front door, had been changed. It wasn't drastically different, just a slightly older design, but he was sure it hadn't been like that when he moved in. Confused, he ran his fingers over the numbers, feeling the slight roughness where the screws had been recently tightened. Someone had replaced it. Not stolen, not removed, replaced. That was when he started paying closer attention. A week later, as he stepped outside to water the plants, he froze. The flower pots on his front porch had been switched. They weren't his. Instead of the small, simple planters he had bought when he moved in, there were now larger, heavier ceramic pots filled with yellow marigolds. He never planted marigolds. He never bought those pots. Someone had come onto his property, removed what was his, and replaced it with something else. His first instinct was to check his security cameras, but he didn't have any. He had never thought he would need them. His unease grew when, later that evening, he found a set of keys in his mailbox. They were old, slightly rusted, on a small, unmarked keyring. He tested them on his front door, his back door, even the garage. None of them fit. The keys weren't his. But the implication was clear: someone was leaving him a message. By the time the woman appeared, he was already on edge. It was late afternoon when she arrived. Nathan had been in the backyard pulling weeds from the small vegetable garden he had started when he heard footsteps on his porch. Wiping the dirt from his hands, he walked around the side of the house and saw her standing there, middle-aged, well-dressed but slightly disheveled, with shoulder-length blonde hair and an expression that was difficult to read. She wasn't nervous, but she wasn't entirely calm either. She stood with her arms crossed, surveying the house as if inspecting something that belonged to her. He stopped a few feet away. Can I help you? The woman turned slowly, her eyes locking onto his as if just noticing him. Then she smiled, small, polite, but not warm. Oh, she said, tilting her head slightly. I was wondering when I'd finally meet you. Nathan hesitated. Do I know you? She gave a soft laugh, shaking her head. No, but I know this house. Her gaze drifted back toward the front door. I used to live here. There was something in the way she said it that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Oh, he said, unsure how to respond. I bought it from the previous owner. I didn't know anyone else had lived here before them. She sighed, as if he had said something disappointing. That's not true, she murmured, running a hand over the railing of the porch. This was mine for years. I took care of it. It was my home. Something about the way she said it, so firm, so certain, sent a cold ripple of unease through him. Well, he said cautiously, I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding, but I legally own this house now. She didn't argue. Instead, she just smiled again, that same thin, unreadable smile. I'm sure you think that, she said, her voice calm. But homes aren't just about paperwork. They have history, and history doesn't just disappear. Nathan didn't know how to respond to that. The woman exhaled, as if letting something go, and took a step back. I should get going, she said. I'll see you around. Nathan, he hadn't told her his name. As she walked down the driveway and disappeared around the corner, a deep, unsettling feeling settled in his chest. Nathan had always been a rational man, someone who relied on logic, structure, and clear explanations. He wasn't the type to scare easily, nor was he the kind of person who jumped to wild conclusions without evidence, but the past few days had left him with a gnawing sense of unease that he could no longer ignore. The woman Karen, as he later learned from a neighbor, hadn't returned since their first encounter, but the unsettling feeling she had left behind hadn't faded. He told himself it was just a coincidence, that the nameplate change, the marigolds replacing his lavender, the inexplicable shift in his trash bins were all minor incidents, that his mind was weaving into something bigger, but deep down he knew better. He knew what he had seen, and he knew it wasn't normal. The moment that truly made it impossible to dismiss as paranoia, however, was the pantry. That night, as he stood in his kitchen, staring at the unfamiliar items that had somehow appeared among his own groceries, he felt a creeping dread settle in his chest, a slow, suffocating realization that someone had been inside his home, not to steal, not to vandalize, but to change things. To make small, deliberate alterations as if they were reclaiming something that was never his to begin with. He reached out, hesitating for just a second before picking up one of the jars. The dust on its surface was thick, untouched for what must have been years, yet it had somehow found its way onto his shelf as if it belonged there. He placed it back carefully, then stepped away, rubbing his palms together, trying to ground himself in something tangible. He needed to think, needed to understand what was happening without spiraling into irrational fear. Checking the doors and windows again, he found them locked, exactly as they should be, yet the chain on the front door felt off. He couldn't say why, but as he stared at it, a cold prickle ran down his spine, as if something unseen had brushed against him. The next morning, he wasted no time calling a locksmith, unwilling to spend another night in a house where the boundaries of ownership felt like they were slowly being erased. The man arrived that afternoon, a stocky, no-nonsense guy who worked quickly and efficiently, changing out the locks on every exterior door. Nathan watched him work, arms crossed over his chest, feeling a slight sense of relief with every removed deadbolt, every freshly installed mechanism. When the job was done, the locksmith handed him a set of new keys, offering a reassuring nod before heading out, leaving Nathan standing in his entryway, gripping the cool metal tightly in his fist. It wasn't just about security, it was about control. It was about reclaiming his space, reinforcing the fact that this was his home and no one else's. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax, albeit cautiously. He cooked dinner, something simple, just to go through the motions of normalcy, and settled in to watch a movie, letting the familiar sounds of dialogue and background music fill the space, pushing out the eerie silence that had settled over the house in recent days. He even managed to fall asleep without the usual restlessness, convinced that whatever had been happening was over, that the locks had been enough to sever whatever strange connection Karen believed she had to this place. He was wrong. The noise woke him in the middle of the night, not loud, not jarring, just the faintest shift in the air, the kind of sound that the mind might dismiss if not for the deep, instinctual sense that something wasn't right. He opened his eyes in the darkness, his breath slow and controlled, his ears straining for anything out of place. For a moment there was nothing. Then, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard. His heart slammed against his ribs as he sat up, his mind racing through the possibilities. Was it the house settling? A stray animal outside? The wind? He reached for his phone, checking the time, 3:17 a.m. Everything was silent again, but he could feel it. That same unease crawling beneath his skin, a visceral warning that he wasn't alone. Swinging his legs over the side of the bed, he moved carefully, his feet barely making a sound against the wooden floor as he made his way toward the hallway. He didn't turn on the lights, didn't call out some primal instinct, told him that drawing attention to himself would be a mistake. As he reached the entryway, he hesitated, eyes flickering toward the front door, and his stomach lurched. The chain was unlatched. His breath caught in his throat. He had locked it before bed. He knew he had. He checked it every night, just like he checked the back door and the windows, yet now it hung loose, swaying ever so slightly as if it had just been undone. A fresh wave of adrenaline surged through him, but he forced himself to stay still, to think. Whoever had been inside was either still there or had already left, but the fact that nothing was missing, nothing was broken, meant this wasn't a simple break-in. It was something else. His grip tightened around the phone in his hand, his thumb hovering over the emergency dial. Calling the police seemed like the logical step, but he hesitated, his mind flashing back to the pantry, the marigolds, the trash bins. If he told them someone had changed his locks back, that they had reorganized his groceries, that they had unlatched his chain and then left without a trace, what would they say? He knew exactly how it would sound, like a man losing his grip on reality, overreacting to things that could all be explained away as minor coincidences. He needed proof. Stepping carefully through the house, he checked every room, every closet, every possible space where someone could be hiding. Nothing. Everything was in its place, but the air felt thick, weighted with something invisible, something he couldn't shake. Returning to the living room, he checked the locks again, securing them with a deliberate finality before moving toward the couch, deciding that sleep was out of the question. He would stay awake, stay alert, make sure that whoever was playing this game with him didn't get the satisfaction of catching him off guard again. As the hours stretched on and the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Nathan's exhaustion caught up with him, but he refused to let his guard down. He sat with his back against the couch, knees drawn up, phone still clutched in his hand. He wasn't crazy. He knew that now. Someone was testing him, pushing him, seeing how far they could go before he broke, and he was starting to think they weren't done yet. Nathan had spent the entire night awake, his body tense, his mind running through every possible explanation for what was happening. Yet no matter how he tried to rationalize it, no matter how many times he forced himself to go through every logical step, he kept arriving at the same unsettling conclusion: someone had been inside his house, not once but multiple times, moving things, changing things, making subtle but deliberate alterations to the space around him, as if slowly erasing his presence and replacing it with their own. The thought sent an icy dread through his veins, a deep-rooted fear that had nothing to do with superstition or paranoia but was grounded in something far more tangible, something primal. He had seen break-ins before, had dealt with theft, vandalism, even violence during his years in the restaurant business, but this wasn't about robbery, and it wasn't random. Whoever was doing this wasn't trying to steal from him, they were trying to push him out, to make him doubt his own reality, to force him into a position where leaving would seem like the only option. And that was the part that truly terrified him. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the blinds, painting thin golden lines across the living room floor, Nathan finally stood, his body stiff from hours of sitting in the same position, his muscles aching from tension. He rubbed his face, feeling the roughness of unshaven stubble against his palms, and exhaled slowly, trying to collect himself. He needed to act, to take control before this escalated any further, because if he continued to let this situation dictate his actions, he knew he would soon find himself exactly where whoever was behind this wanted him, afraid, uncertain, questioning his own judgment. He wasn't about to let that happen. The first thing he did was check the locks again, though he already knew they were secure. He tested the windows, checked the garage, even looked through the attic, methodically searching for any possible point of entry that he might have overlooked. Nothing. No forced locks, no open doors, no footprints in the dust. It was as if the intrusions had happened without any physical trace, as if the house itself was shifting, morphing into something that no longer belonged to him. He shook off the thought, refusing to let his mind wander down that path. He needed evidence, something concrete that could prove he wasn't imagining all of this, that there was someone actively working against him. That afternoon he bought security cameras, 3 high-quality, motion-activated devices with night vision and cloud storage. He spent hours installing them, positioning one at the front door, another at the back, and the third inside the hallway leading to the bedrooms. He tested them, ensuring the feeds were clear, adjusting angles until he was satisfied. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. If someone tried to get inside again, this time he would have proof. For the next few nights, nothing happened. No strange noises, no missing or misplaced objects, no signs that anyone had been inside. At first, Nathan felt relief, but it was short-lived. Deep down, he knew this wasn't over. It wasn't that simple. Whoever was behind this wasn't just playing a game, they had a plan, a method, a reason for what they were doing, and the fact that they had gone silent only meant they were waiting for the right moment to strike again. He refused to let his guard down. Then, on the 4th night, it happened. He had fallen asleep on the couch, exhaustion finally catching up to him, when the sound of movement jolted him awake. His eyes snapped open, his pulse hammering in his ears as he strained to listen, his body frozen with tension. At first there was only silence, a heavy stillness that made him question whether he had imagined it. But then soft, deliberate footsteps. Not loud enough to be accidental, not hurried or careless, but slow, controlled, measured. Someone was inside. Nathan didn't move. His phone was within reach, but he knew that if he made any sudden sounds, whoever was in the house might retreat before he could catch them. He needed to see them, to confirm with his own eyes that this wasn't just paranoia. He reached slowly, fingers wrapping around his phone, unlocking it with a practiced motion, opening the security app. The live feed popped up, 3 screens displaying different angles of the house, and for a moment, everything looked normal. Then, on the hallway camera, a figure moved. His breath caught in his throat. It was Karen. She was walking slowly, almost casually, her hand trailing along the wall. As she made her way toward the bedroom, her posture eerily relaxed, as if she had done this 100 times before. She wasn't searching for anything, wasn't looking around like a burglar. She was simply moving through the house with a quiet certainty, like someone walking through a place they had known for years, like someone coming home. Nathan barely had time to process the sight before he was on his feet, his heart pounding as he grabbed the closest thing to a weapon, an iron skillet, from the kitchen counter, and moved swiftly toward the hallway. He could hear her footsteps now, moving toward the bedroom door, and a fresh wave of adrenaline surged through him. He had locked every door, every window. There was no way she could have gotten inside, yet there she was, moving deeper into his home like she belonged there. He stepped into the hallway, his grip tightening around the skillet, his breath steady, despite the surge of panic in his chest. "Karen," he said, his voice low, controlled. She stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then, slowly, she turned, her face illuminated by the dim glow of the nightlight from the bathroom. She didn't look startled. She didn't look guilty. She simply smiled, tilting her head slightly as if amused by his reaction. "Oh," she said softly, "you're still here." The words sent an icy shiver through him. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" he demanded, stepping forward, his stance firm, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. Karen sighed, shaking her head as if he were the one being unreasonable. Nathan, she murmured, her tone almost pitying. You don't belong here. You know that, don't you? His fingers tightened around the handle of the skillet. Get out. She didn't move. I don't want to call the police, he warned. But I will. Karen smiled again, a slow, knowing curve of her lips. That won't change anything, she said. You'll see. Something in her voice made his stomach twist. He took another step forward, muscles tensed, ready to act if she moved toward him. But she didn't. Instead, she simply turned, walking back down the hallway, moving with that same eerie calmness, her fingers brushing lightly against the wall as she passed. She didn't rush, didn't panic, didn't look back. When she reached the front door, she stopped, glanced over her shoulder, and met his eyes one last time. Sleep well, Nathan, she said. Then she opened the door and walked out into the night, leaving him standing there, heart pounding, 1,000 unanswered questions burning in his mind. Nathan stood frozen in the hallway long after Karen had left, the door still slightly ajar, the cool night air seeping into the house, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and something else he couldn't quite place. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no logic to be found in any of it. She had been inside his home, walking its halls like she had every right to be there, speaking to him not like an intruder caught in the act, but like a resident acknowledging an unwelcome guest. The way she had looked at him, calm, almost amused, made his skin crawl. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't even remotely concerned that he might call the police. It was as if she knew something he didn't, as if she were waiting for him to catch up to a truth she already understood. That thought, more than anything, unsettled him to his core. He moved toward the front door, shutting it slowly, his hands shaking with adrenaline, his pulse still hammering in his ears. Every instinct told him to pick up his phone and call the police, to report the break-in, to have her arrested, but a gnawing doubt held him back. She had walked out of his house with a confidence that suggested she wasn't worried about consequences. That meant either she believed she had some legal claim to the property, or she thought no one would believe him. Either way, he needed to be smart about his next move. Instead of calling the police, he did something else. He retrieved the footage from his security cameras. His hands moved quickly, fingers tapping at the screen of his phone as he pulled up the recordings from that night, his breath hitching when he saw the moment she had entered. She hadn't broken in. She hadn't forced the lock, shattered a window, or picked the door. She had used a key. Nathan's stomach twisted into knots as he replayed the footage over and over, watching in disbelief as Karen walked up to his front door with complete ease, reached into her pocket, pulled out a key, and let herself inside as if she had done it 100 times before. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just the smooth, natural movement of someone unlocking their own home. He felt sick. There was no reason she should have a key to his house. He had changed the locks. He had made sure of it. The locksmith had been thorough, replacing every exterior lock and giving him a fresh set of keys. That meant there were only two possibilities. Either she had found a way to get a copy made after the fact, or there was another key to the house that he didn't know about, one that had existed long before he had ever moved in. The thought sent a fresh wave of unease crawling down his spine. He couldn't stay here. Not like this. Not without knowing how she kept getting in. By morning, he had made up his mind. He packed a bag, just enough clothes and essentials to last a few days, and booked a room at a hotel on the other side of town. He told himself it was temporary, just a precaution while he figured out his next move, but the truth was, the house no longer felt safe. It wasn't just the break-ins, the rearranged objects, the unnerving certainty in Karen's voice. It was the feeling that the house itself was rejecting him, like it had never truly been his to begin with. He left the house that afternoon, locking the doors, double-checking the windows, even going as far as placing small pieces of tape along the door frames and windowsills, subtle markers that would tell him if someone had entered while he was gone. He didn't know what he expected to find when he returned, but he needed proof, needed to confirm that this wasn't all in his head. At the hotel, he tried to clear his mind, but sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing in the hallway, that knowing smile, that quiet certainty. You don't belong here. You know that, don't you? He clenched his jaw and forced himself to push the memory aside, turning his attention back to the security feed, watching the live footage from the cameras he had installed. The house was still, nothing moving, the interior dark and empty. He told himself that maybe, just maybe, this time she wouldn't come back. But at exactly 3:12 a.m., something changed. The motion sensor at the front door activated, the small indicator on the app flashing red. His heart lurched as he sat up, staring at the screen, willing his eyes to focus in the dim glow of the hotel room. At first there was nothing, just the stillness of the porch, the faint movement of trees swaying in the wind. Then, slowly, the doorknob turned. Nathan's pulse skyrocketed as he watched, breathless, as the door swung open, not with force, not with urgency, but with the same slow, deliberate motion he had seen in the footage from before. The hallway camera flickered to life, and there she was, stepping inside like she owned the place, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. She didn't hesitate, didn't pause to look around or check for signs that he had been there. She simply walked inside, slipping off her coat, hanging it neatly on the hook by the door, the same place he always hung his own. His fingers trembled as he hit the record button, saving the footage, his mind racing through 1,000 thoughts at once. He could call the police now. He had evidence, indisputable proof that she had entered his home unlawfully. But as he watched her move through the house, something about her behavior made him pause. She wasn't searching for anything. She wasn't rifling through drawers or taking valuables. She was just existing. Moving through the house the way someone does when they are settling in for the night. She walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, poured herself a glass of water. She stood there for a moment, leaning against the counter, drinking slowly, like she had done it 1,000 times before. Then, she turned off the kitchen light and made her way down the hallway, stopping outside the bedroom. Nathan's stomach clenched. She opened the door. She stepped inside, and then, in the eerie glow of the nightlight, she climbed into his bed. Nathan's breath left him in a sharp, disbelieving exhale as he stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. She wasn't ransacking the place. She wasn't vandalizing or stealing. She was just living there, as if he were the intruder, the one who didn't belong. She pulled the covers over herself, turned onto her side, and within minutes her breathing slowed into the steady rhythm of sleep. Nathan didn't realize he was gripping the edge of the hotel desk until his knuckles ached from the pressure. He had seen enough. This wasn't just a break-in. This was an occupation. And he wasn't about to let it continue. Nathan barely remembered leaving the hotel. He had called the police the moment the footage confirmed what he had been fearing for weeks. Karen had entered his house again, this time with no hesitation, no pretense, no illusion of a misunderstanding. She had made herself comfortable, slipped into his bed, and gone to sleep as if she had every right to be there. The operator had listened to his hurried explanation, taken down his information, and assured him that an officer would be dispatched immediately, but the moment he hung up, he knew he couldn't just sit in the sterile, impersonal room and wait for someone else to handle it. This wasn't just about trespassing anymore. This was about control. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the police car was already there, red and blue lights flashing in the dark. The officer, a tall man with tired eyes, stood on the porch, knocking firmly on the door. Nathan killed the engine, his hands gripping the steering wheel for just a second longer than necessary before stepping out of the car, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. The night was unnervingly quiet. The house stood exactly as he had left it, the curtains drawn, the porch light casting weak illumination over the wooden steps. Nothing about it suggested that there was an intruder inside, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, just the eerie stillness of a home that no longer felt like his own. The officer turned as he approached, nodding once. "You the one who called it in?" Nathan nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, she's inside. I have security footage. She used a key. I don't know how she got one, but I changed the locks. She shouldn't have access." The officer's expression didn't change. He turned back to the door, knocked again, louder this time. "Mom, this is the police. We need you to come to the door." There was a long, unbearable silence and then footsteps. slow, measured, unhurried. The sound sent a fresh wave of unease rolling through Nathan's stomach, twisting into something dark and foreboding. Then the lock clicked, the handle turned, and the door swung open to reveal Karen standing in the dim light of the hallway, wrapped in one of his bathrobes. Nathan felt his breath hitch. She looked at them with mild curiosity, as if she had been expecting this, as if this were nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her evening. She tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a soft, almost amused smile. "Oh," she said, voice calm, pleasant even. "Nathan, you're home early." The sheer audacity of the statement left him speechless, his pulse roaring in his ears. The officer beside him, however, remained composed, his expression unreadable as he adjusted his belt and spoke in a firm, authoritative tone. "Ma'am, we received a call about an unauthorized entry into this home. Do you live here?" Karen blinked, her smile never wavering. "Of course I do. This is my house." Nathan felt the world tilt slightly, reality slipping just a fraction out of alignment, as he turned sharply toward the officer. "That's a lie. I own this house. I have the deed, the mortgage, everything. She's been breaking in for weeks." Karen let out a soft, exasperated sigh, shaking her head as if he were being ridiculous. "Nathan," she chided gently, "we've talked about this. You're confused. You know this isn't really your home." Nathan's fingers curled into fists at his sides, his entire body tense with barely restrained frustration. "Are you kidding me right now? She's insane. Arrest her." The officer turned slightly, giving him a look that was unreadable but not entirely reassuring. "Ma'am, do you have any proof of residence? A lease, utility bills, anything in your name?" Karen smiled, stepping aside and gesturing toward the interior of the house, as if inviting them both in for tea. "Why don't you come inside and see for yourself?" Nathan's stomach turned. The officer hesitated, glancing at Nathan before stepping cautiously over the threshold. Nathan followed, the air inside the house feeling heavier, thicker, charged with something unseen but suffocating. The moment he crossed into the living room, his blood ran cold. It had changed. The furniture had been rearranged not drastically, but just enough to make it feel different. The photos on the walls were no longer his, replaced with unfamiliar images of people he didn't recognize. The bookshelf, once filled with his cookbooks, now held a collection of old, leather-bound novels. Even the scent in the air had changed, no longer carrying the faint trace of his cologne or the lingering spices from his kitchen, but something softer, something floral, something that didn't belong to him. Nathan's chest tightened with something close to panic. "What the hell is this?" Karen folded her arms, her expression serene. "It's home, Nathan. You're just confused." The officer frowned, clearly picking up on the tension but not yet fully grasping the depth of what was happening. "Sir, you said you had proof of ownership." "Yes," Nathan snapped, yanking his phone from his pocket and pulling up the documents, thrusting them toward the officer with shaking hands. "Here. My name, my address, my mortgage, everything." The officer studied the screen, nodding slowly. "All right, ma'am, if you don't have any legal claim to the property, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Karen sighed, as if this were all a minor inconvenience rather than a blatant violation of the law. "That won't be necessary," she said smoothly. "I'll leave for tonight. But I think we all know this won't change anything." She turned, walking past them with the same eerie confidence, heading toward the door without another word. Nathan wanted to stop her, to demand answers, to scream that this wasn't over, but something in the way she moved, in the certainty of her posture, made his stomach churn with an unspoken, inescapable dread. She wasn't leaving because she had lost. She was leaving because she had already won. The door clicked shut behind her, the house falling into an unnatural silence. Nathan exhaled shakily, turning to the officer. "That's it? You're just going to let her walk away?" The officer rubbed a hand over his face, looking exhausted. "Look, you have proof that this is your home. She has no legal claim to it. But if she comes back, call us again, and we'll escalate it from there." Nathan clenched his jaw. And what if she does this to someone else? The officer gave him a look that said everything he needed to know. Karen had done this before, and she would do it again. Nathan had spent the past 2 nights in his house, unable to sleep, unable to shake the feeling that Karen was still watching, waiting for the next move. The fact that she had left so easily, without argument, without resistance, only made it worse. It meant she wasn't done. It meant she didn't need to fight for the house because she already believed it was hers. The police had done nothing, just given him the same rehearsed lines about how she had no legal claim, how he should call them if she returned, as if that would change anything. He had changed the locks again, but the fear gnawed at him, the knowledge that locks didn't matter when the person you were trying to keep out didn't believe she was trespassing. The first sign that she wasn't finished came the next morning when he stepped outside and found his car missing from the driveway. His heart stopped, his stomach dropping like a stone as he scanned the empty space where his car had been the night before. His keys were still inside the house, exactly where he had left them. He checked his pockets, as if somehow he had driven somewhere in his sleep, but he already knew the truth before he even pulled out his phone to check the security footage. The camera feed loaded slowly, but when it did, the confirmation was there: Karen, slipping into his car in the middle of the night, her movements calm, unhurried, deliberate. She had used a key. Again. Nathan called the police immediately, pacing back and forth on the front porch, his free hand clenched into a fist so tightly that his nails bit into his palm. The dispatcher sounded uninterested as he explained the situation, and when the officer arrived an hour later, he delivered the news with the same detached professionalism that Nathan was beginning to despise. There were no signs of forced entry. No proof that the car hadn't been borrowed or given to her voluntarily. It was now a civil matter. He needed to take it up with the courts. Nathan barely kept himself from screaming in frustration. He was being erased. His home, his belongings, his very sense of security. She was taking them one by one, not with brute force, not with aggression, but with a slow, methodical persistence that was far more dangerous. The police couldn't help him. The law didn't seem to apply to people like her, and if he didn't do something soon, he knew exactly how this would end. He would be the one leaving. He would be the one packing up his things, exhausted, beaten down, too drained to fight anymore. And she would be the one standing on the porch, watching him go, smiling that same knowing smile. That was not going to happen. Nathan spent the rest of the day preparing. He filed a restraining order, though he had no doubt it would take weeks before it was processed. He called a lawyer, spent hours documenting every incident, gathering every piece of evidence. He had security footage, police reports, even the strange little changes she had made to the house. But most importantly, he stayed. He refused to let fear push him out. And that was how he was there, sitting in the dim glow of his living room, when he heard the sound. He had been waiting for the creak of the front door. He didn't move. The door eased open slowly, just enough for her to slip inside, her figure blending into the shadows, but he had seen enough to recognize her immediately. Karen moved with the same eerie confidence she always did, her footsteps light but deliberate as she made her way through the house, as if checking to make sure everything was as she left it. Nathan's pulse pounded in his ears, his fingers tightening around the object in his lap, the metal baseball bat he had retrieved from the closet earlier that day. He wasn't going to hurt her. He wasn't even going to touch her. But he was going to make damn sure she knew that this was over. The moment she reached the hallway, he flipped on the lamp. Karen froze. For the first time since this nightmare began, she actually looked surprised. Not afraid, not guilty, just surprised, as if she hadn't expected him to be there, as if she had fully convinced herself that he had already left, that the house had finally emptied itself of him. Her head tilted slightly, that same unsettling smile creeping onto her lips, but before she could speak, he stood. "You're done," Nathan said, his voice low, steady, filled with a quiet fury that left no room for argument. "You don't live here. You never did. And I don't care what kind of game you think you're playing, but it ends tonight." Karen's expression didn't change. If anything, her smile widened. "Nathan," she murmured, shaking her head slightly, "you're overreacting." "No," he snapped, taking a step forward, gripping the bat just tightly enough to make the implication clear. "This is breaking and entering. I have security footage, I have police reports, I have proof that you've been stalking me. You're going to leave, and then you're going to explain to the cops exactly how you got inside. And if you don't, I swear to God, I will make sure you regret every single time you ever set foot in this house." For a long, tense moment, Karen didn't move. The air between them was thick, suffocating, charged with something dark and unreadable. But then, slowly, she exhaled and took a step back, her hands raised slightly in mock surrender. "There's no need to be dramatic," she said softly. "I was just checking on things, making sure everything was in place." Nathan clenched his jaw so hard it ached. "This isn't your house." Karen tilted her head, her gaze flickering over his shoulder, scanning the room one last time before settling back on him. And then, just before she turned, she whispered, "It will be." Nathan barely heard her over the blood roaring in his ears. She walked out without another word, disappearing into the night. But this time, he wasn't going to let her just slip away. The moment the door shut behind her, he picked up his phone and dialed the police, his voice sharp, unyielding, no longer willing to be dismissed. "She just broke into my house again. I have it on camera. I need officers here now this time," they responded. By the time the patrol car pulled up, Karen was still lingering outside, standing by the curb as if waiting for something. The officers didn't hesitate. They approached her, questioned her, and when she couldn't provide any legitimate reason for being there, when they realized that she had been caught on multiple recordings unlawfully entering his home, they placed her under arrest. Nathan watched from the porch, his entire body tense, waiting for something, some reaction, some last attempt at manipulation. But Karen didn't fight. She didn't argue, didn't plead. She just looked at him, her gaze unreadable, and smiled, as if she had already won. Nathan had expected some kind of relief when the police took Karen away, had hoped that watching the patrol car disappear into the distance with her inside would bring him some sense of closure, a finality to everything she had put him through over the past few weeks. But as he stood on his porch, staring down the empty street, the cold night air settling into his skin, he realized that nothing about this felt finished. The way she had looked at him when they placed her in the back seat, the small, knowing smile she had given him just before the door shut, it wasn't the expression of someone who had lost. There had been no anger, no desperation, no fear. She hadn't fought, hadn't pleaded, hadn't even argued. She had simply gone with them as if it were an inconvenience at best, as if she already knew she wouldn't be there for long, as if she was certain that this wasn't the end. That thought settled like a stone in his stomach as he stepped back inside, locking the door behind him and double-checking the bolt, even though he knew it wouldn't make a difference. She had never needed to force her way in before. The house felt different now. It wasn't just the paranoia, the lingering fear that she had left something behind, though that was there too. It was the way the space itself felt altered, the way every room carried the ghost of her presence, a silent imprint of her time there that he couldn't shake. He checked every corner, every closet, opened drawers and cabinets just to be sure she hadn't hidden something, some reminder that she had been here, some quiet message meant only for him, but everything was in place. Still, the feeling remained, and no matter how many times he told himself she was gone, he couldn't bring himself to relax. He spent most of the night sitting in the living room, staring at the security feed from his cameras, watching the house from every angle, waiting for something to happen even though he knew it wouldn't. Sleep was impossible, his body too tense, his mind too restless, playing back every moment, every interaction, analyzing her words, her actions, looking for some clue he had missed, some indication of what she would do next. Morning came too soon, and with it, the cold, hard reality that this wasn't over. The call from the police confirmed what he had already suspected: Karen had been released. There weren't enough charges to hold her, not for long, and with no clear physical evidence of forced entry or theft, the best they could do was file a report and tell him to document any further incidents. He barely heard the officer's words as he thanked him and ended the call, his hands gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had done everything right. He had changed the locks, installed cameras, gathered proof, called the police, followed every logical step, and yet none of it had mattered. The system had failed him, and Karen was free to do whatever she wanted. The worst part was knowing that she would come back. She wouldn't stop, wouldn't let this go, not because she wanted the house in any real, tangible way, but because this was something else entirely, something deeper, something that had nothing to do with legal ownership or property disputes. She wanted control. She wanted to dismantle him piece by piece, to take his sense of security, his peace of mind, his very claim to his own space. And she was winning. He spent the next few days waiting, knowing it was only a matter of time. Every knock on the door, every shadow outside the window sent his pulse racing. Every flicker of movement on the security feed made his breath catch in his throat. He didn't leave the house unless absolutely necessary, didn't trust that she wouldn't take the opportunity to slip inside again, didn't trust that she wouldn't find some new way to push him closer to the edge. His lawyer told him they could pursue a restraining order, but the process would take time, and even then, it was just a piece of paper, something that meant nothing to someone like her. She didn't follow rules, didn't acknowledge boundaries, didn't operate within the framework of logic or reason. And then, on the fourth day, she came back. It was just after noon when he heard the knock, 3 soft, deliberate taps against the wood, not hurried, not uncertain, just patient. He didn't move at first, didn't even breathe, just stared at the door, as if somehow willing it to remain closed, as if ignoring her presence might make her disappear. But the knocking came again, steady, unbothered, followed by the quiet shift of fabric as she adjusted her stance outside, waiting. His phone was in his hand before he even realized it, his fingers moving automatically as he pulled up the security feed, his stomach twisting violently when the image loaded. Karen stood on his porch, perfectly composed, dressed neatly, her hands folded in front of her, her head tilted slightly as she gazed at the door, as if this were nothing more than a friendly visit, as if this were normal, as if she belonged there. She wasn't trying to break in, she wasn't forcing her way inside, she was simply standing there waiting, patient, unshaken, as if she knew he was watching, as if she knew he was too afraid to answer. Nathan's hands curled into fists, his breathing slow and controlled, his entire body locked with tension as he dialed the police. His voice was steady when he spoke, no panic, no desperation, just cold, measured certainty. She's here. She's at my door right now. I have security footage. I have a restraining order pending. Get someone here now. Outside, Karen knocked again, a quiet, almost gentle rhythm, like a friend stopping by for an afternoon chat. Then she took a step back, exhaling softly, her posture relaxed, her gaze drifting over the front of the house, as if inspecting it, as if making sure everything was as she left it. The minutes stretched painfully. 5, 10, 15, and then, finally, the flashing lights of a patrol car appeared at the end of the street. Karen didn't flinch. She turned her head slowly as the officers approached, her expression calm, neutral, offering a polite smile as they spoke to her, as if this were nothing more than a simple misunderstanding, as if she hadn't been arrested just days ago for the exact same thing. Nathan watched through the camera feed, his pulse hammering as they questioned her, asked for identification, pressed her for answers. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw the way she moved, the way she responded, the way she gestured lightly toward the house, as if explaining something reasonable, something rational. Then, finally, they told her to leave. Nathan felt something inside him snap. She smiled at them, nodded, said something he couldn't hear, then turned and walked away, her pace unhurried, her posture still composed, still in control. She didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't protest. She just left. But he knew the truth. She wasn't giving up. She was waiting, waiting for him to break, waiting for him to give up, waiting for him to leave. And as he stood there, watching her disappear down the street, feeling the crushing weight of exhaustion settle deep into his bones, he realized with sickening certainty that this wasn't over. This wouldn't end with an arrest or a restraining order or even a court ruling. She didn't care about any of that. This was a war of attrition, a battle of endurance, a slow, methodical dismantling of his reality, and she had all the time in the world.